Here's the situation we're in for all you who are listening. If you go to see a professional when you have a crisis, psychologist or a physician or a lawyer, let's say, you bloody well better hope those people are telling you the truth. So here's an example. Let's say you got a 13-year-old girl and she has body dysmorphia. That's very common among 13-year-old girls, especially if they hit puberty early, because when women hit puberty, their levels of negative emotion go up. That's a very well-established clinical finding. And the reason for that, likely, is that when women hit puberty, the world becomes more dangerous to them, right? Because they're sexually vulnerable. And that's also when you get body dimorphism develop, so men get bigger than women. And so, women should be more intimidated in relationship to physical combat because they're not strong enough to prevail. So they should be a little more anxious about that. And so they're sexually vulnerable, so they should be a little more anxious about that. And then also, they should be a little more anxious because they have to take care of infants. And if you're going to take care of an infant, you should be a little more sensitive to threat because the infant is extremely vulnerable. So anyways, that kicks in women when they hit puberty. It's very well documented. This is why women have 3 to 5 times the rates of anxiety and depression worldwide. It's because their baseline levels of negative emotion are higher. Okay, so now, but that also translates into something very specific for women. So anxiety and depression, shame, guilt, all those negative emotions, they make you self-conscious. And self-consciousness takes the form of bodily shame in women, much more than in men. So if you're a girl and you hit puberty early, so you're dealing with the complexities of all that when you're still pretty immature, and your negative emotion goes up, the probability that you're going to negatively evaluate your body is virtually 100%. There's no difference, especially in women, between feeling bad about their bodies and being high in negative emotion. It's the same thing. So I just interviewed this Chloe Cole, who's detransitioning and suing her so-called medical professionals who rushed her into a double mastectomy at 15. And the wounds have never properly healed, by the way. And so that's her life. And I basically ran her through a clinical interview. I said, hey, kiddo, when you were 12 and miserable about your body, what the hell was going on? She said, well, I thought more like a boy. She's a little autistic, so she's more thing-oriented than people-oriented. And so she didn't get along with girls that well. And then she was dreaming that she'd turn out like Kim Kardashian, but she turned out to have kind of a boyish figure. And then she thought, well, I'll never really be a good, full woman. And so maybe I should be a boy. And she started to toy with that. And then she went to her medical professionals with this body dysmorphia. And instead of sitting her down and saying, look, kid, you hit puberty kind of early. You got a partially autistic personality style that makes you a little more comfortable with boys than girls. And every girl there is suffers body dysmorphia at your age. So just tap her cool. The fact that you're embarrassed about yourself and feeling inadequate, it's like, that doesn't mean you're marked out as pathological. It certainly doesn't mean you're a boy. No one ever told her that. That's like basic information, man. They just rush her along the pathway. Puberty blockers at 13, and then a double mastectomy at 15.
What is causing this rush to that? Like, how did this happen, and how did this happen so quickly?
Well, this is partly tied up with this issue of the college. So here's one way into it. So now professionals are bound by law to offer gender-affirming advice. They're bound by law. Okay, so this is what this means. If you bring your 13-year-old in to be evaluated by a physician or a psychologist, and maybe she has high levels of neuroticism, tilting towards depression and anxiety, and then that's making itself manifest in bodily discomfort, now that's being shaped by this cultural fad that insists that if you feel uncomfortable in your body, it's because you're of the opposite gender. That's the psychological epidemic part of it. And we can talk about that in a little bit more detail. But now you're duty bound by law, if you're a professional, to say, oh, you think you're a boy? Yeah, absolutely. You absolutely, 100%, you are. What can we do to facilitate that move forward? And that all got, pushed into the law under the guise of the elimination of conversion therapy. So, unbelievable. Now, the problem with that is, you see, if you're a therapist or a physician, you don't affirm someone's identity. That's not your job. And your job is not to deny their identity either. Your job is to help them explore their identity and hopefully to develop it. And so someone comes to you, maybe they have body dysmorphia. And so maybe they're anorexic. That's a form of body dysmorphia. And so the first thing you do, if you have any sense, is you note that that's stemming out of an underlying, more global proclivity to suffer from depression and anxiety. So that's the big elephant in the room, depression and anxiety. So if the trans activist types say, well, the body dysmorphic types are more likely to have suicidal thoughts, it's not because they have body dysmorphia, it's because they're prone to depression and anxiety, and depressed and anxious people are more likely to have suicidal thoughts. And maybe body dysmorphia adds a bit to that, but nobody really knows. Probably adds some. But the fundamental issue is one of depression and anxiety. So now you're suffering from, unspecified self-consciousness, and the culture twists around to offer you a narrative. And the narrative is, oh, well, you're in the wrong body. And then the carrot is, and this is part of it gets extraordinarily pathological, is a lot of these kids who are suffering from this alienation are unpopular. And now they're being enticed. It's like, yeah, well, you're not unpopular. You're interestingly special. So if you just take this carrot, you're the opposite sex, all of a sudden you're not a victim, you're a brave, you're a brave seeker after your redemptive identity. And now you can be elevated and you can be treated specially. And my God, if you're an unpopular teenager, how could anything be possibly more attractive than that? And then you also think, well, why are teenagers gullible in that way? Why do they go along with the crowd? And the answer to that is, that's what you're supposed to do when you're a teenager. That's your job, right? Because first of all, you're with your parents and you're not yet a fully fledged individual. And so what you have to do is you have to become part of the group. And if you're not part of the group, well, maybe you're a stellar, creative genius and you're exceptional in that manner, but more likely you're just a loser who couldn't fit in. And that sucks. That's for sure. So your job when you're a teenager is to fit in, as every teenager knows, and maybe not just to fit in, but, to fit in a positive way that elevates the community. But we could just settle for fitting in. And so teenagers are wired to go along with the crowd. And then if the crowd is offering something pathological, that happens all the time. You get a psychological epidemic. And I knew that. I told you. I told the Senate this in 2017. And why did I know? Well, I knew the literature. We've tracked psychological epidemics going back 300 years. 300 years. Here's some of them. Multiple personality disorder. It cycles in society. Disappears, then there's one case, then it spreads like mad. Then there's multiple personality disorder everywhere. Teenage girls mostly. Then people get skeptical about it, and it dies. And maybe it disappears for a whole generation or two. Then a case pops up. Just does this. That's happened for 300 years. Cutting was a psychological epidemic. Bulimia was a psychological epidemic. Anorexia was a psychological epidemic. The satanic daycare ritual abuse accusations that came out in the 1980s, that was a psychological epidemic. And the rule basically is that if you confuse people about a fundamental element of their identity, then those who are already so confused they're barely hanging on are going to fall prey to that, and all hell's going to break loose. And that's exactly what's happened in the trans situation.
But the difference between this one as opposed to the other ones like multiple